I'll go ahead and get us started. So hello and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the second webinar in our reparations campaign. For those of you that are the Truth Telling Project, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, and Coming to the Table, we are joining forces to host a campaign for truth-telling and reparations. So the first part of our campaign includes truth-telling and education. So this is an educational webinar where we will learn about the history of the slave trade, global reparations, and how that ties into Juneteenth. So just a little backstory about Juneteenth. Even though the US signed the Declaration of Independence, I think that was 1776, the Emancipation of Proclamation, which was a executive order put in by President Lincoln, was not signed until 1863. And that was emancipating slaves from slavery. So even though the United States has been celebrating its independence since 1976, the United States, or Black people, celebrate our independence on Juneteenth. Now, Juneteenth was actually in 1865, which was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, because at that time there was no social media. We did not have telephones where we could pass along the word. And a lot of slaves were still in slavery doing the work until they found out that the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed. So that is why we celebrate Juneteenth on June 19th, our independence. And yeah, David, do you want to talk a little bit more about the history of global reparations?
Can you all hear me now? How's that?
Yeah.
All right.
No. Uh-oh.
Just kind of piggybacking off of what Chrissy was mentioning, we're looking at not only, you know, the freedom for Black folks in the United States, but also if you think about the notion of a long wait for freedom, places like Brazil didn't end slavery until 1888. In addition, you know, we've been thinking about, you know, what are other countries and other histories of reparations? And so one thing we thought about was reparations in places like Germany. We also thought about reparations for interned Japanese people, particularly after World War II, and the reparations that Japan tried to pay to comfort women during World War II. But then if we look at the other side, we see that the claims of Afro-Caribbeans and many African nations that demanded reparations for slavery and colonialism fell on deaf ears, continue to fall on deaf ears. And this is a global failure. It's a failure of the West, the US, and Europe to acknowledge how slavery and colonialism built capitalism. This failure to repair damages is one of the most basic moral failures. Basically, if you think about the notion of restorative justice, the whole motto is harm is done, and we figure out those who are victimized to harm, and we ask them, how can I repair this harm? And then we repair the harm. So, you know, once we have to go beyond that acknowledgement, beyond the notion of simple acknowledgement or even words, particularly in a capitalist global economy where money and land means so much to the culture and power, white folks in power, Europeans. So to offer only apologies seem very little when the material conditions of Black folks around the world, not just in the US and Canada and Caribbean, but the Black folks in Europe who were enslaved. There's a long history of that. Also the theft of indigenous land in Australia, New Zealand, and also slavery in South America. Many of these folks have yet to experience prosperity that the capital, which was built in slavery, built. And
yeah, and I'd like to add, when we talk about talking.
I know, continue, that's cool.
Oh yeah, so when we talk about reparations, yes, we are talking about reparations in the form of compensation. So that is compensation of wealth to kind of even out that wealth gap that we have as a result of slavery. But we're also talking about land. And this isn't something that, you know, Black people or, you know, African descent, people of African descent in the entire diaspora. It's not something that, you know, we're just saying, you know, this was unfair. We owe some, you know, you owe us reparations. This is, you know, was decided on by the UN that, you know, people who have experienced things like slavery and genocide will receive reparations, and that will not only come in compensation, but in restitution. So that would be, you know, restoration of our rights and our political status and equality on that front, and our citizenship status, rehabilitation. So that is putting in programs for psychological support and things of that nature. Satisfaction, which is acknowledgement that this has just happened. So like Dave was saying, like, yes, the apology is important, but it is not enough. It is just one component of reparations. The last but not least, you know, very important, the commitment to putting in a system that this will not be repeated. So that is reforming laws, reforming political structures, and you know, putting programs in place that will you know, prevent violence, further violence in the future. I will go ahead and let me tell you guys how our plan of action for today. So we're gonna do some general and specific questions to our panelists, and then we're going to open up the floor for you guys to ask questions. So go ahead and type your questions into the chat box, and we'll make sure to address those at the end. But first, let me go ahead and introduce Olafemi. Well, actually, do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you've been doing at the university? And then I will ask you your first question.
Sure. Can everybody hear me? Yep. Okay. So I'm Femi. I just finished grad school in philosophy at UCLA. While I was at UCLA, a lot of the work I was doing was around immigration work, including in DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and also I was a member of our graduate student union. Graduate students in the UC system, the University of California, are represented by UAW, United Auto Workers. And so those are the sorts of things I've been doing in general. But what I study is philosophy. I'm a political philosopher. And so I've been doing a project on reparations, arguments for and against reparations, and kind of reviewing historically how people throughout mostly the African diaspora, but I've done a little work connecting it to other kinds of histories of reparations. But how they've articulated why reparations are owed, who they're owed to, what forms they should take, and all that sort of thing.
So can you give us a little bit, just kind of like a brief history of reparations awarded around the world and how that's affected both generations of African descendants and European descendants, and then talk to us about your vision for constructive reparations?
So one thing, I think an important thing to keep in mind, this is a fact that gets talked about sometimes, but often doesn't get mentioned. But an important thing to frame the reparations discussion is that actually reparations for slavery have already been given. And reparations for slavery were given to the former owners of slaves. And so it's important to keep in mind that there's actually nothing unprecedented about giving reparations. The only thing that's unprecedented is giving it to the people that actually should get reparations, right? So 2 examples, when the British Empire outlawed slavery, it essentially paid off the very politically well-connected slave-owning class. We're talking people in England itself, we're talking people based in the West Indies, even some slavers who may have held controlling interests in slave-owning corporations. And this was one of the largest payoffs in the history of states, right? The second example, of course, is Haiti. When Haiti had its revolution for independence, it wanted to join the international system as a nation state, like any other nation state, representing the interests of the people who lived there, of Haitians, and being able to trade with other nations, because the island had been populated and the infrastructure had been built in a way that assumed that there was going to be trade, right? You build up the infrastructure to just make sugar if you assume that you can get food from somewhere else. You assume that you can get, other goods, clothes, and all that sort of thing from the world economy. And Haiti was essentially shut out of the world economy unless it agreed to pay indemnity payments, or essentially reparations, to France for having enslaved the people of Haiti. So it's important to note that there's already been reparations given. So the question is not, can we give reparations? The question is, how are we going to do it the right way this time? And I think the constructive view is just what I'm calling the kind of perspective that I have on reparations. And it's built out of reviewing a lot of what people have said over the years about what reparations are for, movements in the United States, movements in Brazil, Pan-African movements based on the African continent, et cetera. And so the basic idea of that perspective, the constructive view, is something like this. There are a bunch of attitudes that we could take about what went wrong in slavery, what was wrong with the slave trade, and what reparations should be trying to fix. And different ways of describing it kind of lead to different arguments about who owes reparations, who should pay, how much, et cetera, et cetera. So one perspective that's often talked about in academic literature is this kind of idea of relationship repair. So everyone agrees, there are a lot of bad things that happened because of slavery, but for the people that believe in relationship repair, the important thing for them, or the thing they think reparations should be trying to repair, is the relationship between the people that were harmed by slavery and their descendants, and then the social system that we have now. So basically, using the US as an example, the problem that reparations should fix is to fix the political relationship and the social relationship between Black citizens and white citizens on the one hand, and then Black citizens and the United States on the other hand. And I don't think, it's not like that's irrelevant, but there's another way of kind of thinking about why we should have reparations and what it's for, and that's the constructive view. And the constructive view basically goes something like this. Some of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about reparations are backwards looking or about the past, which are what were the harms done in the past that give rise to even thinking about reparations. Some of the things that we're paying attention to are in the present, like where is there poverty? Where is there lack of life chances, lack of life opportunity? We could figure that out just by looking at the way the world is now and wouldn't necessarily have to look at history. And then there's a future thing, which is just what do we want the world to be like? What kind of world are we trying to build? So I think the harm view of reparations is like the relationship repair view of reparations, but it's also like the constructive view in that it has this past, present, future thing going on. But the thing is, the harm view would say something like, people were harmed in the past, their descendants, they were owed reparations, their descendants are owed whatever they inherit from their parents, and one of the things they can inherit from their parents are the things that their parents were owed. So in the future, we should make the world better by giving their descendants the things that their ancestors were owed. And like the relationship repair view, I think that's onto something. But here's the constructive view. Here's the way I prefer to put things. There's a problem in the present tense, which is there's a lot of people, most people on this planet who don't have equal or fair access to the things that were built with capitalism, with racial capitalism. They don't have fair and equal access to the infrastructure, to the universities, to the resources, to the knowledge, to the wealth, any of those things. That's a problem in the present tense. And if we look backwards, historically, if we look to the past, we can say why. They are descended from people who were excluded from all of the ways of building wealth, from all of the ways of getting access to resources. But if we say, if that's our focus, then we should think the future thing we should do is we should construct a better system. So I really like how Chrissy was putting this earlier in terms of reforming our institutions so that not only so that they're not, just the product of a racist history, but also so that they don't themselves cause the same kind of differences in power that led to the problems in the first place. So it's not an accident that our political systems allow us to mass incarcerate some people and funnel other people into prestigious universities, right? And so if we're thinking about reparations on the constructive view, we're kind of de-emphasizing, the things that we're de-emphasizing a view of reparations as a fix to things in the past. The past is what it is, but we're instead thinking more about how do we use the past as a way of putting the right people on the hook for creating the future that we all should want, which is one that, in that version of reparations, there's no chance of directing reparations to the slave owners or, you know, the people that benefited from racial capitalism, because those aren't problems in the present. So that's basically the constructive view.
Thank you, Brother Femi. And I don't know if it's in the information, but Brother Femi is recently appointed assistant professor at Georgetown University because, you know, this wonderful work and research that he's doing. And I just want to let you all know that some of one of our guests to make it, Brother Jamoke from In Cobra, and Lucas, and one of the things that I wanted to just kind of you know, maybe just follow up a little bit and then move on to our next very important panelist is, you know, I actually wanted to think about the constructive view. And I wonder, in thinking about the constructive view, how do we acknowledge how past is prologue? Or we're living out the past. And even if we were to fix the current system, if we were to make sure that people have a fair distribution of goods and rights and you know, are able to go to Harvard instead of being funneled into prisons, I wonder about just the notion of that being what a decent society does, and what at its core it says it should do for every citizen. So sometimes I am worried that we will conflate what a decent society should do, and that is equitable treatment for its citizens. And that could be affirmative action, especially to remedy long-term disenfranchisement. That's what a decent society does. A decent society makes sure that all of its citizens have its basic needs. But the notion of reparation itself suggests that there's this material harm done. But what I do like, and actually like the notion of constructive reparations, is that we should be looking toward the future, and we should be looking toward the future for what is currently happening. And some writers talk about epistemic injustice, or we can look at something and we can see that this is obviously unjust. But when we think about privilege in our society, I think we also have to think about how if one person receives a privilege, you know, arguably someone, for instance, not being stopped by the police and then somebody being stopped by the police, there's a direct transference of privilege, because by focusing on one group to stop by the police, we could be essentially directing energy or unwarranted energy to incarceration of this group. And similarly, and I don't know, folks who've heard me talk or recently listened to our podcast, We Stay Woke, we had a conversation about, for instance, the Center for Investigative Journalism just did a study looking at mortgages across the United States. And they found that Black people, even and often with better credit scores than white people, were getting mortgages. So if you compound this, they actually suggested that this is part of the wave of gentrification. So I do believe that constructive reparations would actually respond to this. But what's so sad is that, you know, this whole wave of gentrification is happening under the Fair Housing Act. So I do think that what constructive reparations answers is how do we avoid creating institutions rooted in the current structure that will essentially privilege the elite? Because we know from Derek Bell's work, who's the founder of critical race theory, that that civil rights, for instance, the only reason, or not the only reason, but the reason why the white liberal elite acquiesced to it was because their interests converged with the interests of the moneyed people. You know, like we can't have, you know, for instance, we can't be looking bad in front of other countries, or our reputation is at stake, or, you know, we're in the middle of a war. We need the Black folks to fight with us, or so on and so forth. So I just want to thank Olufemi for that. And if you want to maybe just respond, and then we can move on to our next panelist, or we can continue.
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, yeah, I agree. The basic point of the constructive view is to keep material stuff front and center. And that has a way of getting out of the picture of the view when on different views. But we can talk more about it later. Yeah.
And so just to, next, I want to introduce Jody Geddes. And Jody is part of our public education campaign on reparations. And Jody is a part of Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And Jody is also helping to lead Coming to the Table. And it's a pleasure to introduce and hear from Jody. And maybe you want to say a little bit, and then we'll ask a more targeted question.
Sounds good. Hey, everyone. Great to see many of you and see your names as well. It's great to be able to have this opportunity to explore and envision collectively. And so don't expect to get all the wisdom from me, but really thinking about how the group often holds the wisdom more than what we can see. So currently, I've been really engaging in a lot of thinking and visioning around reparations. I work with the organization Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth based in Oakland, California. And since 2016, I have been building and supporting an emergent network of over 158 individuals working at the intersection of truth-telling, racial healing, transformative justice, reparations. And so one of the intentions with that, when we gathered in 2016 in Richmond, Virginia, was to think about how to elevate and make visible the work of different people doing this work. And Dave was also at that meeting. And what we began to recognize that often there's a privilege that we have as organizers. We all knew each other, even if we never met before, but wanted to know who else was doing the work and the ways that we could support them. And through that, launch a survey and a national campaign, working on a webpage and a brochure as we currently speak, and recognize that there's so many people doing this work and seeking support. And so you might have an individual in a community that's exploring reparations, but they might not have a group or organization that they're working with. And so I've often had many folks reach out to me from, places like Memphis, Ohio, asking about how can they engage in truth-telling, can they engage in healing and reparations. And so a huge part of my work is not to centralize my organization, but to move away from an extractive and often capitalistic relationship that we have with each other when it comes to building a network. And so when someone contacts me, instead of me being the point person, I say, hey, there's this great person in the network, and this is how we can connect you. So this can be an emergent network that even after a kind of national Truth Commission happened for the United States looking at violence against African Americans, there's a network of folks all across the world, honestly, that are engaging in this work for us to continue to decolonize our systems and structures. And so we know that we can work at the intersection of relationships, and at the same time, we also need to think about the systems and structures that inform those relationships. And then in addition to my work, this is the last thing I'm gonna say, and then allow you to ask the question because I might be getting ahead. In addition to the work with Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, our joy, I'm the board chair for Coming to the Table, which started with this vision of bringing together the descendants of enslavers and those that were enslaved. And so genealogy and DNA research is a huge part of that work. Many people have come to the table and met from what appeared to be different sides, but really the same side, and feeling the same kind of grief and pain and seeking that joy, restoration, and healing. We just had our national gathering again. Last week, I just got back on Sunday, and that was really incredible. And that's moved even further to say, what are other ways besides this uncovering history that we can really transform systems? And so in January of this year, a reparations guide was released. I agree with folks when we think about reparations, we're often centering the voices of white people. And so this guide is a draft, and it was created by like a very racially mixed group, and yet that is not enough, because we've internalized the ways that systems have viewed us, and we've also internalized the way that systems have viewed money and reparations, right? And so it is a draft, and so I encourage folks to look at it. I can put the link in the chat, and if there's feedback that you have, give it. It's really about reparations moving from the personal to the structural level, that some folks are like, I don't know what this system is. I don't understand racism. All right, cool. So what can you do on the personal level instead of shaming and pushing folks out of community where they'll continue to perpetuate and do harm and not recognize the ways that they've received unearned privileges? And so that's one of the things I appreciate about that document, that it's really moving from the internal reparations to the structural reparations, and says that this is living and breathing, and we don't know the answers, and we also don't need to center the voices of white folks in what reparations look like. I can say a lot more, but I'm gonna end there and allow Dave to ask the question.
Well, I think you were getting to some of what the question is, but you know, can you talk about a vision for a national truth-telling that could be reparative and restorative?
Yeah, and so there's been many different truth commissions that have happened even in places that we don't know about, and so I want to be able to uplift them. One of the truth commissions, where the film that was just really recently published on, is the Wabanaki, Maine Truth Commission, and that one was really powerful. There's a film called Dawnland that was just released, and one of the striking things in that film for me was when the Secretary of State, Matt Dunlap, I'm just gonna call him out, right? Call him in, you know, hopefully he sees this. Reparations came up, and he was immediately like, well, I hope like they don't want reparations, you know, but like Wabanaki, Maine Wabanaki folks like didn't bring that up. But also, to keep it real, like the fear that I believe that like people who have been taught to call themselves white have around money. And I think that's directly connected to power, and that's directly connected to race. And that when we're talking about, for me personally at least, and some folks that I know, when we're talking about reparations in the form of money, we're talking about economic dignity, right? And so this is the same thing when it comes to like access to housing in places like New York, right? Like, is that housing dignified? Are the ways that I'm able to show up in community, is that with dignity? Like, even when we talk about like minimum wage, right? Like, am I talking about a living wage, and where money doesn't define my humanity, money doesn't define my dignity? And so I'm really thinking about conversations around reparations that is really focused on transforming systems, and not just seeing money as this kind of capitalistic interaction where you're just taking from folks, but we're not changing the conditions that have led us to the places that we're in. And so I'll say that to say that our vision around a truth commission or truth and reconciliation process, right? Language is often tricky, and we're troubled when we think about what reconciliation looks like versus healing and justice, right? And we should, I believe, continue to explore that. But for us in our organization and our network, is really thinking about a process that is really centered on restorative justice, right? And often I think that we don't recognize that there is a part of us that I believe was in relationship with each other before systems of harm and power and violence were in place, right? Whether or not we were there to experience that, right? So what does it mean to engage in a process that is looking at our humanity, and how do we restore our humanity, right? Because if I'm doing violence and harm to you, I believe that there's something that I'm also killing inside of myself. So how do we engage in a truth-telling process, a truth commission that is really thinking about restorative justice, right? So one of the things that, many of the things that restorative justice offers is, one, being able to think about healing, but also accountability, right? That there's this way that the system hasn't named the violence of slavery in this country. It has not been named. I think often folks, like Black folks that look like me, are on the end of always having to name that as a process of remembrance, right? So that folks can acknowledge the legacy that we have today, right? So when we talk about slavery, right, or enslavement, we're talking about that as a past, but there's this legacy that is left behind, residues of trauma and harm and violence that also is present in many other countries. And so, for example, I'm thinking about my native country of Jamaica, right? That when we are often talk about Jamaica, like, we don't acknowledge the violence of slavery that existed in the country, and how like hospitals haven't been built in over 40 years, or like the rape that's continued to happen to like Native women. Like, there's so many things that we don't acknowledge. And I think there's a way that we believe that just naming that slavery happened is naming the implications of that, naming the violence of that, naming the systemic harm of that, and how the residue still exists. And so the process that we're really thinking about building is one that call folks in and yet is able to hold them accountable, right? And we don't know what that would look like. And so looking to folks like the Wabanaki Maine TRC, looking to Gachacha, looking to Liberia, which I'm hoping that they publish a report soon, looking to communities who have been able to pass down this legacy of remembering that is really centering the humanity of folks. And I think often in this country, I sometimes find myself, it's hard to dream that up. It's hard to dream what that can look like. And so we're designing and exploring with that right now, and hoping to bring back maybe the beginning of next year, as we're seeking funding, to bring back folks who can begin to design what that process will look like. I think I can strongly say that if our joy was to just propose a process, I think that folks will follow, because the legacy of Fania Davis and so many other folks. But we recognize that this is only going to be possible in community, that we need to lean into the wisdom of community, and also to think about a process that is emergent, a process that continues to live on, where 5 years down the line, we're not saying, why haven't these recommendations been implemented? Because we're looking to folks we believe have positional power to be able to put those recommendations in place. So there's this idea of like, who's the inside community and who's the outside community, right? And so I think that, well, I know that the process that we are exploring is really about thinking about one that holds folks accountable, and also says that like we all need collective healing, and also focuses on the transformation of systems. So we can't have something that just feels good. Like, we need to shift some structures, like we need to transform some structures that are continuing to perpetuate that harm within our communities. I hope that answered the question, but it's also okay if it didn't.
It did. I mean, just in general, there's a couple points, and then we're going to open up for one or two questions, and then we're going to have a brief question afterwards. But one of the things you pointed out as you were talking was like, just to me, I was thinking about the notion of restorative justice. And I think when you were talking about how someone was saying, you know, I hope they're not asking for money, I think that's very, that conversation happens. We were in DC at a book release. A colleague and I wrote a book chapter on systemic humiliation. And one of the panelists, one of the other authors said, well, you know, even from a response from Nelson Mandela's grandson, who was in the audience, and he was asking about reparations as we were talking about truth-telling and talking about what South Africa was doing. And the colleague on the panel said, well, you know, there are other, you know, things other than reparations. And my response was very similar. Like, first of all, we're talking about what Black folks are asking for. And one of the reasons why we're in the place that we're in is because folks go into these communities without asking, thinking that they can lead, thinking that they know better, and deciding for us what should be done. What does it look like for Black-led processes? And I think that's important. And then the notion of remembering, and just from the global perspective, you know, why did Brazil in 1888 destroy all of its records when they ended their slavery, slave institutions? Because they didn't want folks to remember. And I think we have to remember for so many reasons. It's not that it makes us, but I think that part of, and this is what I talk about a lot in Fellowship of Reconciliation, is, you know, how do we actually get to reconciliation? And part of getting to reconciliation is reparations. You know, because when harm is done, it has to in some way be repaired. And even if it is constructive, like it has to be constructive. And money isn't the only aspect of reparations, but how do we look at where society is now and realize that there are folks who have very different material conditions. And we look at what communities look like. And, you know, even when we were in Ferguson doing truth telling, a lot of people, you know, came and cried. And crying is okay. And we're happy that, but we want things to actually change. So what does it look like for material conditions to change? And how do we call folks in to the kind of healing that can come from making a long-term commitment to repair or do one's part in repairing what's wrong with the society and the real injustices. And so just to round out our questions, we have one more question, and this is for all the panelists. And Chrissy, feel free to join in and respond to this question as well. Chrissy Jackson, given the significance of Juneteenth, what are your overall thoughts on reparations and the lack of Africans, a lack of it for Africans in the United States and in the global diaspora, given all of the countries who have recently went to, you know, former European colonizers and asked for reparations? So given the significance of Juneteenth, what are your overall thoughts about reparations? And Olufemi, do you want to start off, and then Chrissy Jackson, and then we'll end with our sister, Jody Geddes.
Yeah, sure. There's one of the important things about Juneteenth is the actual story of how it was that, you know, that Black folks stopped being enslaved. And so W.E.B. Du Bois writes about this in Black Reconstruction, but the basic idea is, you know, there was a massive kind of general strike, and Black folk just kind of collectively said no to work, either by, you know, deliberately sabotaging work on plantations, or kind of mass leaving, like physically leaving plantations, active sabotage, joining the Union Army in the hundreds of thousands to participate in the war effort against the Confederacy. And the way that this gets told to us nowadays is that Abraham Lincoln thought about it real hard and made a proclamation one day, and then Black folk were free, right? But you know, like, it's easy to laugh about this now, but you know, if you're a kid and you don't have any other information, that's what your teacher says. That's a way of thinking about it that makes sense. And if later you go on to organize, it's not hard to see why you might think that what this is going to take the form of is whichever white man is running things in your day and age, eventually having a change of heart and coming to think that, you know, Black folks should get what they're owed. So, you know, we as people need to reconcile. We as people need to collect with each other and build solidarity. But as far as the like elites go, as far as the people who communicate with their rivals in the world via predator drones, as far as those people go, like those people are only going to respond to organizing. Those people are going to respond to the kind of people power that we can build when we have all those kinds of solidarity that everybody on this panel has been talking about and working towards in their activist lives. And so I think, to me, that's the message of Juneteenth. If we seriously want the kind of change to our political environment that I think reparations can and should mean, materially, politically, ethically, in terms of how we teach history, in terms of how we run our institutions. If we want that, that's going to take a massive, I think, transnational effort. And, you know, the scientists tell us we have only a few decades with these polar ice caps. So, you know, we should get moving. And I think there's a lot to say about the connections of reparations and climate change, but I don't want to eat up too much time. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Femi. And to build on that, when I think about like steps moving forward, what kind of organizing needs to happen in order to move towards reparations, I'm a very firm believer in, you know, putting healing at the forefront and the whole, you can catch more flies with honey. So I think that while truth telling and reparation, it just has to happen. Even before then, I think that an important part of organizing could be to just get a commitment. Because if we could get a commitment and a buy-in from people that, you know, are descendants of slave owners or people who have benefited from slavery, then we can kind of get that accountability in the beginning and not hold it over their heads and it be this accusatory process. Because I think that that is something that turns a lot of people away and kind of makes people automatically shut down when it comes to thinking about reparations and taking it seriously. So if we can think about ways to make this an inclusive process and a process about healing, and then work towards a truth telling that includes people who have benefited and people who are not benefiting from slavery, but then also a truth telling process that is specifically dedicated towards empowering people who are descendants of these people who have been enslaved. Because even, you know, with the healing that comes for reconciliation between the two parties, we need to, Black people, African people of African descent, there is a huge, huge need for empowerment in our communities. And a lot of us believe that, you know, these people are superior to us. And even if we're not saying it with our words, it is being, you know, and reinforced in, you know, our subconscious in the media. Way too often do I see people of color feeling validated because they have, you know, white people a part of a project that they're doing. I mean, it shows itself in so many different ways, but I think there needs to be kind of like a parallel truth-telling or and reconciliation process, one between, you know, people who have benefited from slavery and people who are descendants of slavery, and then one that is just within the communities of color, that is empowering, uplifting, and again, not in a way that is putting people down and, you know, saying, you know, we're better than anyone, but being radically inclusive and keeping at the forefront, like, what is the vision that we want for the future? And really doing some like thought out brainstorming about that. So in every step of the process, we're keeping that vision in mind and not falling into kind of like emotions that will come up that could, you know, divide us or in any way make people want to not be a part of this process.
Thank you so much for that, Chrissy. I think a lot of what you said really resonated with me, particularly when I think about the diaspora and just my home country of Jamaica and this commission, this reparations commission that is formed with over 15 different countries, Caribbean countries, really exploring what reparations can look like. I think there's a process that we need to call in the inclusive bodies of people who live in the United States and are experiencing the residue of our history and legacy of slavery. And also, I think often are not having the knowledge of that, right? So much of my own work of understanding this country's legacy was not in school, as to be expected, right? So much of that was the forced assimilation, because assimilation isn't like folks are like, sure, I want to assimilate to American culture. It's kind of like, if you don't, you can't get further ahead. So many other reasons why, but I think, and so I'll say that I think so much of our conversations and the spaces that we're creating needs to be really inclusive of the multiplicity of what Blackness looks like and shows up like in this country, to be able to move towards reparations that I think is inclusive and intersectional in the ways that we view history and the violence of this nation, of this country, and also being able to look to those places to see how the way that they're engaging in reparations is directly connected to the ways that we are engaging in reparations. And I think that's just particularly important when and this is a little bit selfish when I think about my own country and just the displacement of people and communities, the loss of land for a lot of farmers, the continual violence, the increase in HIV and AIDS rates, and so many other things. And yet, like, the United States has had a hand in my country that's often not talking about, you know, the British, the Spanish, so many pieces of what history looks like that is not named, right? And so I agree with so much of what you're saying. I think it's important to tap into the diaspora that exists in this country to be able to continue to be expansive in our vision of what reparations looks like and how we name reparations. And I think some of that is also deeply connected to what happens when there's like an overflow of emotion and an overflow of trauma seeping through people's bodies, and to how to acknowledge that in the present, and also to be in a place where we can envision the world that we want to create. And I think those things are hard to do. And when I look at the different truth commissions that have happened, folks were in that place of overflowing. So, and stayed in that place of overflowing even after recommendations may have been made. And so there was this difficulty, I think, envisioning the world that folks wanted to create, and also wanting, I think, honestly, to get over it, and rightfully so. And I think that's in part having to do with the difficulty of naming the trauma that exists in Black communities, because the way that systems have pathologized our trauma and the harms in which we've experienced. And so I think the significance, at least for me, when I'm looking and thinking about Juneteenth, is the way that I see people remember and the way that I see people celebrate, and how that is an outcry and a pouring out of their bodies. And my hope and wish for that vision to be expansive and all-encompassing, and one that brings in the vision of folks in the diaspora that are living in this country. And so that really resonated with me. Yeah, I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you all. And we're gonna go to questions now. And I want to acknowledge Dee Dee from North Carolina, who has a question. Dee Dee, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Hello, everyone. Happy Juneteenth. Thank you for
Happy Juneteenth.
thank you for having this call. Yeah, so I am based in Durham, North Carolina. I do some statewide organizing with young people with an organization called Ignite and See. You can look up our website. I wanted to, just a lot swirling in my head. One question I have around is around strategy, of me being an organizer as a priority, and also as a choice. I'm thinking about the differences in the strategy of organizing people around reparations locally and nationally. I'm thinking, and then like, what are the political opportunities in those specific places? I think right now there are a multitude of political opportunities in terms of like specifically around the immigration, and all of the ICE raids and all of that. There's a political opportunity that's opening around a conversation around that. And here in Durham, back in August, we took down a Confederate statue, and that has now opened up an opportunity for us to figure out what it means to have monuments in this city, in this very, very Black, very rich history of Black people, and having statues and monuments. And then what does that mean in terms of a strategy, in terms of a way of reparations, in terms of a way of truth and reconciliation. And then just like thinking about like restorative justice was thrown around a lot. So my first question is local versus national. What is it? And then around the restorative justice thing, I think folks mentioned a lot that that folks are having a hard time envisioning, and because of so much of the trauma. And I think I think part of it is the trauma, but I think a much, much larger part of it is trust. So when you say restorative justice, like what are we restoring to if you don't want people to be in your community? And so, or you don't trust the people that are in your community. And so like, if most young people in this country don't trust the government to even vote, like participate in voting, what does it mean to try to build a strategy around truth and reconciliation, and getting to a place of restorative justice when people don't trust the people that are that are having to do the restoration. And so I think like, yes, trauma and healing, to me, the bigger component is around trust. If you don't trust the people that are even gonna say that they're gonna do a thing, or that they apologize for a thing, or that they acknowledge, or all of that accountability doesn't mean anything if we don't actually trust those folks. And so I guess like in terms of the fight for reparation, or restorative justice, transformative justice, what is the like trust building component that is more than having conversations? And like, is there some kind of not standardized, but some kind of practice that folks agree to, that if these things are met, then that can equate to some possibility of trust within the reparations framework. And yes, I'll stop there. I just also think like reparations, whether you know the insides and outs of it or not, it's so polarizing. It's just like either you believe in it or you don't. Even if you're like, I remember when I was a child, just hearing about reparations, I was like, oh yeah, white people giving Black people money because we was enslaved. Yes, it was just that simple. And I know it's not that simple now. However, it is such a polarizing strategy and a way of thinking in terms of organizing that makes it that gives a point of where we want to go. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you, Dee Dee. And so glad you are here. And
Thanks for
can
having me.
I just real quick, I want to respond and then pass on the mic really quickly. Just what you said, polarizing. I agree it is. It's polarizing when Black people talk about reparations. Because, like Femi mentioned, reparations has been paid out. It's one of the things that, and the definition that Chrissy read is from the United Nations definition of reparations. But also, restorative justice, a lot of people have a problem with it because often it's been used as a way to basically reinforce discipline, reinforce a violent structure and make kids feel good about it. And I've seen teachers bring kids to a restorative circle to get even with them, embarrass them, all kind of stuff. And it depends on who's running the circle and who's doing. But for me, restorative justice is about the redistribution of power. That is the point of a circle. And reparations is if we understand the notion of justice, justice is distributive, restorative, and retributive, or at least those are some of the primary areas of restorative justice. But also restorative justice is distributive. If we think about how power is distributed, right? Then just the notion of the circle is redistributing the positionality of people so that power is more equitable. And as a result, reparations is a core part of restorative justice. People who've been harmed pay, and then maybe we can restore humanity, or something. And often there is very little to be restored. But I'm going to leave it to that, and we'll go Chrissy, Femi, and Jody, and we'll hear Ethan. If you can read some questions after that, a few questions, and then whoever wants to jump in can jump in.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Dee Dee, for your questions. I actually think that those are really important points to make. Like in my mind, part of my personal vision for the future is I would love, this future where future of integration and equality. But the truth of the matter is there has been some really, really horrific things that have happened in our past, and not just once, and not just in a small concentrated period of time. It's been over, a long period of time. So I think with the process of truth telling, or a large part of what truth telling is getting together communities to talk about the trauma that they've experienced and talk about what justice looks like for them. And I do think it's an important part of the conversation for us to, if the majority of people are getting together and are saying, telling their truth, and what justice for them is not, this radical vision of integration, and it's not this, redistribution. It could be to, create their own communities. It could be a very uncomfortable conversation to have, but I think that the trust factor is a very real one. I know I've been there myself. I'm not there now, but I know a lot of people are, and it's warranted. I mean, just facts from history, So I do think it is important that, whether we move in that direction or not, that we take that part of the conversation seriously when it comes up, and decide together if that is what do we want to, I know that, people at N'COBRA are have suggested having communities who are moving towards healing and redistribution of wealth, et cetera. And then there's a community of people who kind of want to go and claim their own land and for lack of a better word, you know, start their own Wakanda. And I don't think that we should, I think that it is important that we, you know, talk about that, because without talking about that, we're essentially doing the same thing that our colonizers have done, which is go into communities and tell them what we think is best for them. So, you know, no matter what our personal visions of the future look like, you know, it is important to have truth tellings where everybody, as many people as possible, are including their personal voices and what, you know, justice and future looks like for them. And then it's our responsibility to work together to make sure that, you know, people are able to live in a way that is healing for them and they can live in their best communities.
And just really quickly, we're about 5 minutes from being done. And Ethan, can you read a couple more questions? And then if Jody and Femi, if you can respond as briefly as you can. Jody, Christy, and Femi.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I think one that that's come through the chat is, and it reflects a couple other messages, relates to how to, let's say, what is the best way to engage quote unquote good white liberals, aka super problematic white liberals, in a way that properly engages with the most urgent issues of racial justice as the primary goal, yet which pragmatically leads to action by those who unjustly hold power. That's the one that I'm seeing right now off the chat. And we had received also one in advance of the call that was of a similar bent through email that lifted up actually the work of another group called Caucasians United for Reparations and Emancipation. So I think both of those conversations relate to how to, what is the role of white allies and solidarity from white communities in supporting people of color-led and black-led movements for reparations.
And feel free to jump in with responses to the previous question as well.
Okay, a lot happening here. I'm trying to make it brief. One of the things I will say is that restorative justice is a term that we now have to name a indigenous practice of healing and justice, right? And so we're in a system that often doesn't create space for us to talk about healing collectively. It's often about doing to someone instead of doing with someone. I think that's the first thing I will say. And I will also say that circle does not equal restorative justice. Circle is a process that's used as a part of restorative justice. And so, for example, we can look at processes like Gachacha and the Liberian Palava huts as restorative processes that was really much bounded by indigenous practices of healing that folks had already used in community when conflict and harm happened. Right. And so I think throughout time, we can see both in Afrocentric tradition as well as Native tradition, Caribbean tradition, ways that folks have engaged in restorative justice, even if it's not called that. Right. And so I think that's really important to be able to uplift that we have this word to describe practices that have been passed down through generations of community and family. And we have systems of created walls and barriers so folks wouldn't practice that anymore. So folks wouldn't see conflict as normal and lean into it in healthy ways. So we wouldn't be disposing of each other in community. Yes, to Dave's points, really thinking about a redistribution of power, that when we are engaging in circle process and other restorative processes, we're really thinking about a redistribution of power. And I saw a question in the chat that was really about, I think someone that's a teacher that's really thinking about how this shows up in the classroom. And I think this applies all across the board. When folks are talking about restorative justice, they're not leaning into it with an anti-racist, anti-biased lens that is also doing a deep examination of systems and structures. And so we have schools where young people are sitting in circle processes and getting suspended or shamed and blamed, and that the problem child begins to be this identity that they're taking on. What we're having is a school that is not engaging with an anti-racist, anti-biased lens, because they're only using now this circle to do the same kind of harm that was happening by giving out a demerit and suspending, right? And so this is a challenge, I think, to practitioners. And I happen to be working at an organization where there's majority Black staff, and we're serving a majority of Black and brown youth. And we are constantly, I think, digging deeper into how do we grow in our anti-racist and anti-biased lens, because to be Black is just not enough to know, right? And so I think a part of the misconception around restorative justice is the language that we're using to name it, restorative justice, right? And so I think it's about really beginning to think about this process of remembering. And so what are some other practices that may have been passed down in our own families and our communities that are directly reflective of restorative practices? And I know that exists for me as a Caribbean American woman. And there's also no standard way to do restorative justice, even if folks are naming circle process as the way to be restorative or to do restorative justice. And I think that's why I want to highlight that we, the gathering we're hoping to host, we're really hoping to bring folks together to design and envision what this process can look like. So we are asking the questions about what does trust look like? What does it mean to create a safe space and a brave space? And the only way for that to be possible is to be able to happen in community. And also acknowledging a process, we are not putting power into the hands of people and systems who have perpetuated and continued harm. And so when we're looking at other truth commissions, that's exactly what happened. So how do we design a process for the United States that is centered in the power of the community, that is grassroots, that is centered in the power of the people, and the possibilities of that, I think for me, particularly in the US, is reflected in the Maine Wabanaki TRC, where folks are really leaning in to indigenous practices to be able to really think deeply about restorative justice and to think deeply about healing. One last thing I'll leave you with is there's a scene in where there's a conflict. I'm giving this away. I hope this is okay. It's already released. There's a conflict that happens, right, between Wabanaki Native folks and white folks from the TRC who were asked to leave the room. Because what was happening is that Wabanaki folks that are coming in to either share their story or be witnesses, they saw all these white folks that they didn't know that felt ownership to their stories. And so the white folks were asked to leave by the Maine Wabanaki folks. And there began to be this conflict around colonization. And folks really felt like they had a right to stay in the room to witness and listen and to be able to hear those stories. And folks were like, no, you don't. Like, this isn't your community. Like, this isn't your story and you don't have a right to it. And for the first time, they were beginning to have those conversations around colonization, around language, around ownership, right? And so my hope is to be able to design a process where we're already having those conversations around where power exists. How does it show up? We're talking about patriarchy. We're talking about class in the design of this process. And it doesn't mean that conflict won't happen. It just means that at least we've had some conversations. So when it happens, we begin to lean into it in healthy ways. And so this project, this system, this emergent system that I'm holding or trying to hold is really about tapping into the wisdom of community members like you, Dee, right? To say, what are some things that you want to lean into? What conversations should we be having? And what does a vision look like that is inclusive and thinks about trust and thinks about power and is intersectional, is expansive, and also holds people of power responsible. And for white folks, I think y'all need to be talking to other white folks. Stop thinking that you woke and you know it just because you have a Black friend or you're engaging in Black spaces such as the NAACP, that the work is continuous. Talk to folks in your community, be brave, because sometimes you have a lot more privilege to be able to do that and lean into that. And also to read some authors you don't disagree with, maybe about your implicit bias as well as your white fragility. Thanks, that was a lot.
Femi. Thank you, Census.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, to me, one of the other benefits of focusing on material interventions is you are focused, you're organized around what's actually at stake, or at least what seems to me to be at stake. So if the particular reparations project that we're going for is, a community that doesn't have power getting some kind of green energy project there or something, or whatever it is, or a community that doesn't have a hospital getting a hospital. We know what we're organizing for, we know what victory will look like, and we know what failure would look like. And neither side of that is decided by whether or not you are individually a good person, good ally, good accomplice, whatever word you want to use. None of it's about whether your politics are right or whether you were, the right person. And we can kind of just bypass a lot of these conversations, or not a lot of the conversations, but we can bypass a lot of the hangups and obstacles that get put in place when people are in organizing spaces trying to organize around their own like kind of psychological hangups rather than around, what's at stake, what we need to build, and what we're trying to win as a group. So that's what I would say.
So thank you all for attending. I just want to thank the panelists and my co-host and impromptu panelist, Chrissy Jackson, also co-director of the Truth Telling Project. I want to let you all know that we are in the process of very soon launching a reparations landing page that in part goes with what is essentially a public education campaign and about reparations, so we can learn in public and have these conversations in public, because people don't actually understand what it is. But reparations, given the Poor People's Campaign, and given what King was talking about, economic justice and economic dignity for what Jody was talking about, and the notion of constructive reparations, but then also not reproducing the violence that we're trying to move out of, as Chrissy Jackson was saying, and then trying to avoid more harms for Chrissy Stonebreaker Martinez. We are trying to learn in public with each other and have this important conversation, because it's such an intersectional, urgent conversation. And we thank you all for attending. And I think Ethan and I also put up some Twitter addresses you can follow. But if you check out @for reparations, you can see just the progress of this group. And all of these videos will be available online. And also, We Stay Woke just released a podcast about reparations with We the People of Detroit co-founder Aurora Harris. And right now they're dealing with continued water issues. So Chrissy, do you want to say a final word as well?
Just thank you everyone for joining us. Looking forward to continuing the discussion with you guys. Our website will be up soon, but in the meantime, follow the links that Ethan and I posted. You can find us all by searching on social media, The Truth Telling Project, Our Joy, Oakland, and FOR USA, or Fellowship of Reconciliation. If you type any of those into the search bar, you'll be able to find us. And we'll be posting our website soon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you all.
Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth. Thank you.